Welcome, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling telling time, but with a bit of a twist.
A twist.
Yeah, we're looking at it from a different angle. Our source material today is actually a web page. It's called Telling the Time, Grammatica Inglesa.
Okay.
And, well, it's from a website that teaches English grammar to Spanish speakers.
Interesting.
So we're going to kind of look through the eyes of someone learning English to see what we can discover about how we as English speakers think about time. What do you think?
I love it. It's amazing how much we can learn about ourselves when we see our own language through the eyes of someone learning it for the first time.
Right. So, okay, let's dive in. The source points out that in English, there are basically like two main systems for telling time.
Okay.
We've got the traditional way, like with an analog clock, and then we've got digital.
Yeah. And that's the same in Spanish, too.
Yeah.
Both systems are used. But it's interesting because the language itself actually reveals some pretty fascinating cultural differences when you compare how they're expressed.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Like, think about traditional time telling. In English, we have that, I don't know, I kind of think it's charming, that quirk of using like past and to.
Right.
So we say things like, 2:15 or 20 to 12.
Yeah, it's like we're picturing those hands moving across the clock face.
Right.
Like those minutes, they're not just these abstract units of time. They're physically progressing past the hour or moving to the next.
It's so visual, like you're really envisioning it.
Exactly.
That's totally different from just saying something like 2:25 or 12 less 20, which the source mentions is more common in Spanish.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, does this subtle difference in the way we describe time, does it point to a deeper cultural difference? Like in how we actually perceive time itself? Do we see it as this flow, this journey around the clock, while other cultures might focus more on the numerical value of that exact moment?
I never thought about it like that. It's like we're almost personifying time, giving it that movement with that past and to language.
Absolutely.
And this visual aspect of it, I guess it's even more obvious when you consider how we don't usually need to say AM or PM with traditional time telling. Like, the context usually makes it pretty clear. If you
Sure.
say 7:30 in the evening, there's no question about what time you're talking about.
Right. But then you go to digital time, and it's like a whole different ballgame.
Totally. With digital, like 2.0 could be 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon.
Exactly. So suddenly, AM and PM becomes super important, like crucial for understanding.
You need that extra precision.
Right. It's almost like digital time with its, stark numbers. It just demands that extra level of accuracy. There's no room for, interpretation based on context.
And speaking of precision, the source points out that in digital time, we pronounce a zero as O.
Oh, right.
It's 1:05, not 1:05.
Yeah.
I know it seems like a small thing, but
But it really shows how, deeply ingrained digital time has become in our lives. It's not just reading numbers anymore. It's practically its own, dialect with its own special way of pronouncing things.
that's fascinating. It makes you think, how much technology really shapes the way we speak.
For sure.
Even something as basic as telling time can give us a peek into our own cultural values and how those values are changing.
Absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface here. So, as we were talking about digital versus traditional time, it really struck me. It's like these different systems we use, they might actually reflect, much broader cultural attitudes towards time itself.
Okay, now you've got me really curious. What do you mean?
Well, think about it. That traditional system with its past and to language, it suggests a certain fluidity. Like this sense that time is constantly in motion, a journey around the clock.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's less about being super specific about the exact minute and more about just where we are in relation to the hour, the overall flow of time.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But then you contrast that with digital time and its, very precise numerical display. It's like it's all about capturing that one specific point in time.
So does that mean then that cultures that prefer traditional time telling might be more relaxed about things like punctuality and schedules?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily about being, on time or late, but more about that fundamental understanding of time itself. Cultures that lean towards the traditional system, they may view time as more cyclical, interconnected, like even organic, Whereas those that prefer digital time, they might see it as more linear, chopped up into segments.
So it's almost like some cultures see time as this, I don't know, flowing river, while others see it as the series of specific points.
Exactly. And that can really have implications for how people approach things like deadlines, schedules, even just casual social interactions.
That's a fascinating distinction. So, bringing it back to our source material, what can we maybe glean about Spanish culture from how they approach time?
Well, the fact that they use both traditional and digital systems suggests a certain flexibility, right?
Yeah.
But, we have to remember this source is really focused on teaching English grammar. So it doesn't really dive deep into these kinds of cultural comparisons.
Right, right. It's not an anthropology textbook or anything. But it did mention that Spanish might use phrases like two and a quarter or 12 less 20, which
Mm.
seems to focus more on that precise numerical value of time, like you were saying.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah.
It could suggest a slightly greater emphasis on precision, at least in certain contexts. Of course, we have to be careful about making broad generalizations about entire cultures,
Mm.
just based on little language differences.
Right, of course. Every culture has a lot of variations within it. But this deep dive has definitely got me thinking differently about how something as basic as telling time can reflect these broader cultural values.
Absolutely, and that's what I find so fascinating about language. It's not just about, conveying information. It's this window into how different cultures actually see and experience the world around them.
So let's get practical here for a minute. How might these differences actually play out in real life situations? Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's say, you're meeting a friend for lunch. In a culture that tends toward that more traditional time telling, arriving a few minutes past the agreed upon time, it might not be seen as a big deal.
Yeah.
It's more about that general time frame.
Right, right. Whereas in a culture where punctuality is really valued, even a small delay could be seen as disrespectful.
Exactly. It's not that one culture's approach is right or wrong. It's just that those perceptions of time, they're shaped by, different cultural norms.
Yeah, it's all about being sensitive to the fact that time might not hold the exact same meaning for everyone.
Exactly. And that awareness can go a long way in helping us understand each other better and avoid misunderstandings.
This conversation has really given me a whole new perspective on something I honestly never thought much about before. I don't think I'll ever look at a clock the same way again.
And that's what makes it so great to explore these things, right?
Hmm.
It helps us challenge our assumptions and just better understand the world.
So before we wrap up this part, I want to circle back to something our source mentioned, the whole idea of midday and midnight. What is it that makes those terms so important?
Well, they represent these, like, key moments in the day, these points where things transition, right?
Yeah.
Midday marks that shift from morning to afternoon. And midnight, of course, it signals the end of one day and the beginning of another.
And the source even mentioned a difference between noon and midday. Like it's hinting that midday might actually refer to a broader period of time. It's not just that one pinpoint moment, but more of a transition zone.
That's a really good point. And that nuance is reflected in how we use the words. You might say something like, I'll meet you around midday, which gives a more flexible time frame. But if you say, let's have lunch at noon, it suggests a much more specific time.
So even within just one language, there are all these subtle ways to convey these different perceptions of time.
Absolutely. And that's part of what makes language so fascinating. It's always evolving and adapting to reflect our understanding of the world.
This has been such a thought-provoking discussion. It really shows how even something we do every day, like telling time, can actually tell us so much about our cultural values and how we see the world.
I totally agree. And I think it's important to remember that we can always learn more, even about the things we think we know well.
Okay, before we move on to some final thoughts, any key takeaways for our listeners as they kind of digest all this?
I would say as you go about your day, just pay attention to how people talk about time. Listen for those subtle word choices, the emphasis on precision or fluidity. You won't be surprised by what you notice.
It's like we're asking our listeners to become linguistic detectives,
Right.
uncovering those hidden meanings in everyday language.
Exactly. And you never know. You might even discover something new about your own relationship with time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the world of telling time. And wow, I don't know about you, but my mind is officially blown. I mean, who knew there was so much to uncover in something as simple as, looking at a clock?
Right. It's amazing how something we do every day, without even thinking about it, can actually reveal so much about us, about our culture, our values, even our own personal perceptions of the world.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground here, from traditional versus digital to that whole past and to system and all those really interesting cultural nuances around like midday and midnight. So as we kind of sing this all together, what would you say is the most valuable takeaway for our listeners?
Hmm, that's a good question. If I had to boil it all down to one key point, I'd say it's awareness. Like, by understanding all the different ways that time is expressed and perceived across cultures, we become more sensitive, more effective communicators.
So it's not just about knowing, like, the mechanics of telling time in different languages. It's really about understanding that deeper cultural context.
Exactly. Imagine, you're traveling in a culture where time is viewed more fluidly. Being aware of that might help you avoid getting frustrated if, say, meetings don't start right on time, or if schedules change unexpectedly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or on the flip side, if you're working with someone from a culture that's really big on punctuality, you might adjust your own approach to be more in line with their expectations.
Right. It's all about recognizing that our own personal perception of time isn't the only one out there, and being willing to, adapt a little to bridge those cultural differences.
It's like a whole new level of cultural sensitivity that I never really considered before. I know I'll definitely be paying closer attention to how people talk about time from now on. It's like a whole new world has opened up.
I agree. And that's what's so exciting about exploring these, seemingly ordinary topics. It forces us to question our assumptions and expands our understanding of the world in ways we never could have imagined.
Okay, before we officially wrap up, is there any final thought, any parting wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
As you go about your day to day, just pay attention to how people around you talk about time. Do they use those precise, numerical terms, or do they prefer those more like fluid, descriptive phrases? And what might those choices tell you about their own personal perspective and values?
It's like we're giving our listeners a fun little challenge,
Great
right?
track.
Become a time detective, uncover the hidden meanings in everyday language.
I love it. And you never know, you might learn something new about your own relationship with time along the way.
Well said. A huge thank you to you for taking us on this incredible journey. And all of you listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.